Good afternoon, and welcome to the July 25th, 2018 Utah Division of Drinking Water webinar series. This will be a shorter one, this will be a late afternoon one. I know I said that in our last webinar that we would be doing, I couldn't guarantee what day in July, but I knew it would be at 11 a.m. Turns out I was wrong on both counts. July proves just as difficult to schedule for as I thought, with vacations and conferences and everything and the like that I warned you about. And it's nice to be right about that and so wrong about other things. Despite that, we have Patti Fauver with us today from the Division of Drinking Water at the ever-running spring of knowledge on Utah rules and drinking water regulations to talk about sanitary surveys and each of those quizzes we put out at the end of the webinar that you have to get your CEUs. Sanitary surveys is consistently one of the top requested topics that we cover. And so today we are giving the people what they want after a nice late afternoon lunch. And if you're watching this later, hopefully you're prepared and ready for that. Keeping it brief, there are a few reminders. It is still lead and copper sample season, so check your monitoring schedule to see if you are on 3-year monitoring or in summer monitoring for that, and get those done now. DVP sampling is also now. So during those summer months, those seasonally sensitive samples are due, so check up on that. If you are a seasonal system and you haven't turned in a seasonal startup plan and you opened this summer, you need to get on that and check and make sure before deficiencies go out and points get assessed and enforcement trickles down. July 1st, consumer confidence reports are due for all of you community systems. Violations for that are going out very, very shortly. And so you should check and make sure on WaterLink that compliance schedule is closed out. If you've done the CCR, make sure that we have it. A couple of upcoming trainings. August 14th, there's a rural water training in Green River covering best disinfection practices and how to best prepare and maintain disinfection throughout your system. This is also applicable even if your system is not one that continually disinfects, because it talks about how to deal with disinfection following a line break, or sort of how to do batch disinfection when you need to in an emergency or event. So even if you're a system that doesn't disinfect, this training is still applicable to you. There's also the upcoming Fall Rural Water Conference in Layton from the 27th to the 30th. Register for that. If you're looking to bulk up on your CEUs, that's a good time to do it. If you're a new operator or pending operator looking for certifications, another good time to look at taking the rules or the operator certification class. There's a wastewater training also through Rural Water on September 5th in Richfield. And then on September 12th, we have 2 trainings in 2 different locations through Rural Water. We have the disinfection practices training, the same one that was in Green River on the 14th in Camas. And then on the 12th, there is a training on cross-connection and sanitary surveys in Saratoga Springs. So, if you're trying to get both of those, look at doing going to Green River in August, and then hit the cross-connection and sanitary survey training in Saratoga Springs. For more information on either of any of those, you can check the Utah Rural Water Association's website. Not a lot of news. We did have the Data Managers User Conference here, which I told you meant very, very little to any of you, but it's a big deal for the Division of Drinking Water to host a national conference like that with other regulators and data people from across the states, as well as at the federal level. We were able to play host to a number of people and talk about issues that were relevant to Utah. There was a lot of talk about some of the interesting things we've done to work with labs to ensure better data transmission. It was a nice chance to show off some of the interesting and advanced things that Utah really is doing. The Division of Drinking Water is fully staffed-ish. I think we're down, we have maybe 1 opening spot that hasn't been filled just yet. And that means I say ish because per audit, we're still woefully understaffed by where we should be, but for all the positions we have, they are filled and rolling forward, and that's big. It's been a while since we've been able to do that off. And then in August, we have our quarterly compliance meeting, action compliance strategy meeting, where we review and look at all systems that have pending compliance issues and look at escalating enforcement and where they're at on an enforcement meeting. So if you're a system that has high IAPS points or has received multiple violations and you want to avoid further escalation of enforcement, like I assume that you all do, please start checking in to your IPS report on WaterLink, contacting the division and working with us to see if there's any violations we can clear up before we get to that point. If you have questions, as always, the chat feature is the way to ask them. I'll be working that when I turn it over to Patti and kind of checking to make sure audio is still working. And with that, we'll turn it over to Patti. Pop up her server. Okay, you're good.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I have a lot of slides, as you can see, or maybe not, but anyway, I have a lot of slides, and they challenged me to do this presentation in 30 minutes or less, and it'll take every second of those. We will try to move through the slides pretty quickly, though, and Colt's here to keep me on task. So I was tasked to talk about sanitary surveys, what are they and how you can prepare for those. So let's go ahead and get started. A sanitary survey is a on-site inspection of your public water system. It gives us a way to look at your facilities and make sure they're up to snuff. It also gives us an opportunity to provide one-on-one training with water personnel and some technical assistance. So we like to kind of do the full service with that. It somewhat depends on your inspector and their depth of knowledge, but we try to make sure that it happens with every survey. Why are sanitary surveys conducted or important? Well, first of all, it's one of the cornerstones that protects public health. We need to make sure that there's no avenues for contamination to enter the water system. So we're going to look at all the kind of wear items of your water system. You kind of look at it like a vehicle inspection. That's really what we're doing for your water system. We're not going to be looking at the design components per se that are in concrete and hard to change. You've gone through plan review for that. Hopefully, if doesn't meet current standards, you got an exception or it met standards when it was built. But we'll look at those wear items and make sure that, again, there's no avenues for contamination that have appeared since that facility was built. It is an EPA requirement that we have a sanitary survey program and that systems are surveyed on a certain frequency. As part of the rule requirements, we're audited on that by EPA, so it is an EPA requirement. And then again, we're going to determine the compliance with rules and construction standards. So it's not just the construction standards, which is the physical inspection of the facilities, but also looking at some of your records and some of your management programs as well. How often do we do those? Again, it's an EPA requirement. We're looking at systems every 3 years. This has varied across time. Back when I first started, it was different for non-community water systems versus community water systems, but we've standardized on every 3 years, I don't know, probably since about 1995. So you can plan on that. Who will do your sanitary survey? We contract with our local health departments as well as our own staff. So you'll see Division of Drinking Water staff, our district engineers who work for the department, and then also the local health department staff coming out to look at your system. They should be contacting you a couple weeks in advance to set that up. And then they should also be finishing up your survey and writing out, or giving you the report within 30 days of the site visit. So, you know, there's some timelines. Some of those are courtesies, and some of those, but in policy, but then some of those are also EPA rule requirements. And then again, how we assign those, you really shouldn't be seeing the same surveyor over and over again. We're looking at having different eyes on your system over time. But the main reasons are that we use to assign surveys to people is based on the complexity of your water system. In some cases, we bundle your system with other systems. And by bundling, we mean, trying to get efficiencies with your time and our staff time as well in common ownership. So the Forest Service has lots of campgrounds. We'll try and bundle the ones that are close together with the same ranger district so that we can be efficient in that manner. And then also we'll also look at a system that has compliance issues. And if they're struggling with any certain thing, we might send that rule manager out to look at your system so that they can maybe dig a little deeper and see what the underlying causes for that is. When we do a sanitary survey, there's some prescriptive things that we have to follow from the EPA regulations. And one of those is the different things, the elements that we look at. EPA actually has 11, but only 8 are required. So the 8 that we look at are listed here: monitoring, system management, operator certification, source, treatment, pumps, finished storage, distribution. In other words, all your physical facilities. And we also look at your management and some of your record keeping as well. So all those things are fair game during the sanitary survey. And we'll look at those. One of the things when we find deficiencies, we'll note those, and we have deficiencies that range from recommendations to minor deficiencies of things that are found and things that you should look at. The deficiency that you really need to pay most attention to, though, is what we call a significant deficiency. And significant deficiency has the potential to allow introduce contamination to your system and cause a problem. One of the things when we identify these, so these are at state discretion, what are identified. We were required to provide at least one in each of the 8 categories. What we have for significant deficiencies is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 75 that we identified with the groundwater rule. So deficiencies are not a new concept. We've had those really since sanitary surveys began, but the adoption of the groundwater rule in 2009, we had to then identify those significant deficiencies, the ones that are most, put the system most at risk for contamination. So that's a significant deficiency, and what's important about that is it can cause a federal violation and also get you points on our tracking system and prioritization system, which Colt will be looking at in August with the compliance meeting. But it also does it on EPA's score sheet too. They have a slightly different score sheet, which is the topic of a different presentation because we don't have time here. But the deficiencies that are identified need to be fixed. We track those in our database, all of them, not just the significant ones, and then you need to fix those and let us know. The key timeline with significant deficiencies is you have 120 days after we find that or the site visit to fix it, or you'll get a violation. So you need to pay attention to that. And that again flows into our improvement priority system or your report card. And you get your points. And again, if you look across those elements, the quality monitoring, public notice, all the things that go into that score, many of these things are also in that list of the 8 elements. It's also things that we looked at during the sanitary survey, so it's kind of multifaceted, which hopefully this Venn diagram shows. We have sanitary surveys that'll go out and look for sanitary hazards, deficiencies. That's just one piece of keeping the water safe. We also have our engineering reviews, construction standards, plan reviews, operating permits. But then there's also operator certification. You can have the best plan in the world, but if you don't have a competent person operating it, you're not going to get safe water. And then process controls. So it's really the kind of the gamut of things that we're requiring. And a lot of those things we'll be looking at during the administrative review of your water system. If you have a treatment process, we might ask you to look at, to pull out some of your reports. All those reports you send to us, you also have to keep a record of those, or keep copies in your records for certain amounts of time, and they vary based on the type of report it is. So that might be something we would be asking to look at during a sanitary survey, as well as some of your other administrative things and the physical facilities. So sanitary survey, kind of that is a preface. Each system will have a unique sanitary survey because you have a unique system. We have a program that will look at the inventory of your water system and pull up a question set that matches your inventory. So if you have one well, one tank, distribution system, we'll pull up one set of questions for each of those. In contrast, if you're a bigger system and you have 10 wells, well, we'll have 10 sets of well questions and however many tanks you have. So it really, every survey is unique, and it's facility or component driven. And then we'll look at the rules that apply to your water system. So depending on what type of water system you are you a community water system? Are you a non-transient system? Are you a transient system? We'll look at some of these other things in the depth that they need to be looked at for your type of water system. And then again, for some of you, there are other people that do surveys as well. Like, for example, the Forest Service, they may have other things that they'll look at the same time as they're doing a sanitary survey for us. They may be looking at some other things. So for those of you listening that are with those other type of entities, you probably experienced that in the past. So during the survey, hopefully a discussion is had. If there's any confusion on why we're asking a certain thing, it's why it's important. Why do we require the air vents to be downturned? Why do we require them to be screened? Why do we need an air gap here? Hopefully, if there's any confusion on that, your surveyor can dispel that. And if there continues to be confusion, please give us a call, because we want you to understand why these rules are in place. Ongoing operator training, we have had in the past and continue to have some very experienced operators, drinking water operators on staff. And hopefully they can relay their knowledge of operations. But we also have engineers, we have rule managers, and in that dialogue, some of that information can be transferred. And where appropriate, we really try to limit recommendations, because that's not our place. That's really kind of a consulting engineer's place. But where we can offer simple recommendations, we will try and do that. So element number 1, this is the monitoring, reporting, and data verification. We're going to look at your system records. Usually, well, it just depends on your facilities, but when we look at this, we want to look at the inventory, sample history, things like that. We'll look at your population and make sure that to record any changes. If you've grown number of connections, we'll look at your certified operators on staff and make sure that they meet the requirements. And we'll also look at your IPS report. And it's one of the things in red there, just to emphasize, if you make corrections to any existing deficiencies, the survey itself doesn't correct that. It's not a passive process. It's really you need to take some type of active act. You have to take action to change that, I guess. So if you're not, you need to submit something to us, or actually document on the IPS report that you're reviewing, here's the changes, and have the surveyor sign it, or fill out the IPS deficiency correction form and send it to us. The fact that you just have a survey that doesn't find it again won't take it off the IPS report. So we've told you that for a dozen years. We'll probably tell you that for another dozen, but please remember that. So we'll look at those background reports of various types. Our surveyors are required to pull those up and take them with, or review them as they go out on a survey. So they should be able to talk to you about those. You look at management programs. We're looking at the cross connection control program, emergency response program, plan that you should have on your shelf, if nowhere else, but hopefully it's not too dusty and you can pull it out and it has actually current people and phone numbers. Some of the operational issues. If you have any treatment, we'll ask about that. If we've received any customer complaints, we may talk to you about those. One of the most common ones is lack of pressure. We might even have a pressure gauge we'll ask to put on your system during the course of the survey. So those are really those management type issues we'll look at. Just a brief review on cross-connection control. Remember, there's 5 elements. You'll need to look at all of those. So if you're preparing for a sanitary survey, you should probably dust off your cross-connection control program and be prepared to answer questions on it. Again, verify your list of operators, make sure that it's meeting the required level that we have for you, and then also have your system records handy if we want to look at any of those. So these are just some quick screenshots of the reports that we have for you. This is just the report header that's common across all of our reports, unless you combine them into the master report. So that it has a system information. Your surveyor should be showing this to you and saying, is this still the correct information? And you should be able to go through and correct that as you go through that kind of administrative review for your water system. This information is pretty critical. It determines what type of water system you are. It has a huge impact on the type of monitoring schedules we assign to you and the number of samples you're required to take for various rules, from the total coliform to lead copper to disinfection byproducts, etc. So we need to really have this information correct. The inventory, we'll go through, and there's different pieces to that. This is just the top part. We'll review your bacteriological summary report. If you have any positive samples, we might explore with you why you think that happened. If you have more than a single occurrence in this report, we probably will explore this more, but we'll look at that and see what the situation is, again, for your specific water system. Monitoring schedule report, we'll go through this. Hopefully we'll highlight, the surveyor should be highlighting any samples that are due in this current year. Just as a gentle reminder for you to take them. If they're past due, maybe highlight them in red. Anyway, so this is, again, a chance for you to look at that and get that reminder. And then if you have any issues with your IPS report, bring it to your attention. This happens to be one that's pretty pristine, but if you had any here, it would identify those issues. And again, this would be an opportunity for you to, with your surveyor, to look at the issue, document that it's no longer there, have it signed, and get it off your record. So with those reports, one of the things that I learned this year was how to print these off of our website. Hopefully you all have an account and can get on our website, but how to print them so they're pretty, and all the graphics come through. So if you're at our website, you pull this up. When you hit the print page, you'll get this dialog box. You'll want to open it up, and where you see those options there on the left-hand side with the header and footers checked, well, you just want to check one more box. You include the background graphics, it'll print nice for you. So that's my hack for today, is if you want to print these out looking nice, there you go. I know Rachel's done a webinar on this before, but here's the super secret checkbox. Again, another reports that you don't necessarily have access to, but we should be looking at your source protection report and exception report if you have any exceptions to our construction standards. Those are all part of that administrative review. And if you do have exceptions, hopefully you have a letter. And if you don't have a letter, hopefully it appears on this list, because that exception is kind of, for whatever that is, if our engineering section agrees with that exception, that's you're not going to get efficiency for that get out of jail free card. But if we don't have it recorded in this exception report, then we will require you to make corrections to that, whatever that may be. But this will list out what we have on our in our records for your water system. And the sanitary surveyor should have that with them as well. So really, I kind of went over 1 through 3 on that, if you were following along, not just listening. But when we get to element number 4, it's all the sources collectively. So with those, of course, the types of sources are pretty different. So with a well, we're going to look at sanitary seals. We're going to look at the mineral. Make sure you're using food grade mineral oil if you're using that for lubrication. We're going to look at the casing, making sure it's above the floor level, the appropriate amount. We're going to look at cross connections in the well house. We're going to look at all those things to make sure that there's no avenue for contamination to enter into your well. So I'm going to fly through some of these pictures. So here's one where we might have concerns about whether or not that's an intact sanitary seal for that, because it's two pieces. So we would be looking, hopefully checking that out. That might be one you would be concerned about. Here's one that looks pretty okay with all the different elements there, with the air vent, the shutoff valve, and the flow meter that's required for a well. We'll be looking at the screens on the vent. So on the vent, not only is it that it's there, but that it's has the downturn vent, and that it's screened, and that it terminates a sufficient amount of distance above any floor or containment. Floor drain. So if you pipe it down to the floor, it needs to terminate with a sufficient air gap above the floor. So we'll be looking at those things. This is nice and clean. We don't necessarily grade you on cleanliness, but it's certainly nicer to see it that way. We'll look at that, note any deficiencies, we'll note any problems there. So here's another one that if you look at this particular well, I would be concerned just looking at the picture, not being there in person. I would be concerned about that dark spot just underneath the cap. Is that just discoloration, or is that rusted, and can critters crawl in through that opening? We've had several instances over the years, probably a dozen or more, where a critter has crawled into the well, and we had one where we were taking bets on what the half-life of the lizard was for contamination. So you don't want to have to be on the receiving side of that bet. Anyway, so we want to make sure that that's intact in this case as well. Here's another one that has a couple problems. You can see where the electrical cable comes up, and is that sealed? So we'd look at those types of things and make sure that, again, that there's no avenue for contamination to kind of fall into that wellhead there. This one shows a hose that probably came out of an air vac valve, and it's just laying up top of the drain. That should have something that holds it above so that it doesn't fall into the drain. It has to have an air gap that's sufficient at the end of that hose. For springs, some big items. If there's any ponding of water over the collection area, that's going to be a problem. If we see the impervious, needs to be a liner, or there has to be soil over the spring area, which is kind of hard to see when it's developed properly. So if we see it, then that might be a problem. Or if we can't, when we look in the spring box, if we can't see sufficient depth, that might be a red flag as well. We're looking for deep-rooted vegetation around the spring collection box, number one. And number two, if we see roots in the collection box, that's even a worse problem. So we'll look at that deep-rooted vegetation, and then we'll look at the collection box itself. Is it designed properly? Does it have all the right attributes to make it safe? So if we go to the attributes, this kind of is a nice diagram that outlines a well-developed spring box. So you're going to have the 4-inch rise on the access. You're going to have the 2-inch lip on a shoebox type lid. You'll have a locking device that doesn't penetrate the top of the box. You'll have the air vent that's properly turned down and screened with the proper size mesh screen. You'll have an overflow that has free fall and is also screened as well, different type screen or different size screen. So you'll look for all of those or their variations in a spring development. So here is some problems with it, like a diversion channel. We want to make sure the water, as it flows across the ground, is diverted away from your collection area, because we don't want that ponding of the water on top. If we see at the edge, kind of that picture there on the bottom left, where there's maybe some liner material that's exposed, that's not a good thing. And if we see any standing water, that's not going to be a good thing. On the other hand, you can look at the gasket. There is a gasket. Hopefully it seals tight, and it looks like they have a pretty decent shoebox lid there. So we'll be looking at all those things. We look at the deep-rooted vegetation. Again, the one on the left is pretty good. There's no vegetation there. That might cause other problems that we're finding, especially after some fires and some flooding, that we want at least some grasses there, and not the deep-rooted vegetation, but some vegetation. And then on the right, you'll see the deep-rooted vegetation there that probably needs to be removed. Because that can lead to this one. This is an old slide, but it's pretty, illustrates pretty well what deep-rooted vegetation does and looks like. So this is in a spring box. You can see that white there in the bottom. That's all roots. And the problem with roots is not only that they take the water, but the bigger problem is that if the roots can get down into the spring box, so can contamination follow that same line of the root and get into the spring box as well. So that needs to be removed and remediated. The condition of the box itself is a concern, so you can have all the proper rises and the proper distances, but if the concrete is not intact, then again, that's an opening into the spring box that can cause some problems. This one looks pretty good from this viewpoint. You'd want to look at it from all viewpoints to see that it's up to snuff. This one, on the other hand, is a little too low. You had a flash flood that would not withstand that very well. And then we have this one, which looks pretty good, but if you look at the hatch, the box cover itself, this is a hatch that we don't particularly like because the handle's on the top, and if it gets rusted off, then you have openings right into the spring box itself. So we don't particularly like those, but if you have that, make sure you maintain that handle and make sure that the rivets that go through the top of the box there are not rusted out and have a sealant there if necessary. The other thing with this particular one is the vent itself looks great from this picture, but if you look closer, kind of bend over and look at the bottom, it has a big opening in the vent line for the screen, so you'd want to pay attention to that. And your surveyor should be doing that. They shouldn't just be standing in one position asking you questions. They should actually be looking around and seeing the facility and wandering and observing. Obviously, this is a bad situation where there's ponding on a spring collection area. This is a fairly old picture. It's not this way anymore. So, but that would be a very problematic spring source where we would be looking at UDI influence fairly heavily on this one. And here's a overflow that's doesn't have enough free fall. You can just see it at the very bottom of the screen. So we would be looking at that somehow to channel that out to divert that water away without backing up into the pipe and be making that requirement. So those are springs. And the element number 5 is treatment. And we look at all the treatment plants from surface water treatment, although we do restrict those surveys to our engineering staff and highly trained staff. We also have disinfection facilities, fluoridation facilities, and other types of treatments in smaller numbers throughout the state. But all of those have a set of questions that we'll ask during a sanitary survey and potential for looking at your treatment records, of which all of these treatments do require records to be kept in your filing system. So again, here's just the different types of treatment plants you might find. Their variety, surface plants, just because I had a picture. And we won't talk much about the treatment process, but we can look at all of those things with our engineering section and all those wear items we would be looking at, this is just an illustration of one of the wear items that we would look at, and that's an air gap, making sure that it still exists where it's appropriate in all the various facilities and treatment processes where you're kind of wasting that water, making sure that there's that air gap into the receiving facility so we don't get any backflow. It's just an example for a treatment plant. If you move on to disinfection facilities, by far the most common disinfectant we have in the state is chlorine. So we would be looking at, the various forms of chlorine treatment from gas to hypochlorite, and looking at those treatment facilities and making sure that they're meet standards, operational, and safe. So we'd be looking at how you store your facility, your cylinders, if it's gas, the full ones versus the empty ones. We'd be looking at the measuring devices, whether it's a scale, whether it's a volume for the liquid. We would be making sure that the tubing is free of, is vented properly and screened properly. And that the gauges where you inject it are there and operational. So the things that make the treatment operational, we're going to look at safety factors to some degree, and your records again. So treatment facilities, pump stations. These are facilities that we didn't have in our records till 2006. But if you have them, we're going to be looking at them again from that functional standpoint. Some of the requirements are interesting here. So redundancy is required if you have a pump station that is required to provide the pressure that we require. We required redundancy. If the pump station is not required for that, then the redundancy is optional. So some of these issues depend, or some of the things we look at will depend on exactly your situation with your water system. So here's, again, just a generic diagram of a pump station and what we'll be looking at for that. Finished water storage tanks. Finished water tanks are one of probably the single facility that has the most deficiencies found on them. Don't know if that's just because they're above ground. Easy to see the deficiencies, that might be, but they have a lot of wear items that probably fail over time, so that might be another factor. But we want to make sure they have the shoebox type access. We want to make sure that they're vented properly, that the overflow piping is properly screened and sized and sloped, etc. So with your storage tanks, again, we want to look at the drainage of water away from the tank so that the foundation isn't compromised. We'll look at that you have a watertight roof. Contrary to Seattle and New York City, we do require our finished water reservoirs to be covered, which I think is a good thing. Anyway, so we'll look and make sure that they slope to drain, that you don't have puddles on the roof causing problems. Again, the drain lines and overflow pipes and access hatches, and then any penetration. So this is just a kind of variety of pictures to show you different penetrations for various SCADA systems, etc., and making sure that they get sealed properly. So again, no contamination can enter. We're going to look at the hatches and make sure that they're raised appropriately, and to some of them we'll look at the interior. So if a surveyor doesn't look inside your tank, then they're not doing a complete job. They should be looking inside every tank. You should be prepared for that with the proper keys and such. Again, we'll be looking for any leakage, any damage. Small things in concrete tanks become big things, and that's kind of, we've tiered our deficiencies to reflect that. If it's minor damage versus major damage versus a big old hole in the top of the tank, our response would be appropriate to the risk of each of those. So here's some examples of some pretty good tanks that you can see. Again, nice access. You can see the vent that's a candy cane. Can't see the screen, but you can get on there and look for it and see that it's appropriate. We have tanks that are concrete. We have tanks that are metal. One of the things we don't have typically in Utah is we don't have the elevated tanks. We only have a handful of those compared to the storage tanks that are on the ground or buried. So we'll look at some safety features. We're not OSHA, but we do have requirements for the access. So we'll look at those, and if you don't have those, you might get a deficiency. But some examples of some good safety cages. The ladders are not the best way, but we'll be just looking for access there. Here's some with, again, some nice access ladders, railing at the top. Those are all nice things. It's, again, OSHA is not our rules, but they still apply to you and your water system. So that might be, if you don't have a good access and safety equipment there, it's more a problem with OSHA than with us, but we'll look at it in a brief manner. We'll look at the accesses, make sure they're up to snuff. We want to make sure that they have a nice gasket all the way around, that they seal tight, that if you have these metal lids that hook on, that they actually are the proper type. If you look at the one that's in the middle there, you can see that it kind of has an overhang. The construction, that's meant to be sealed in concrete. In this installation, it's not, so it might have access up underneath. Have to look at that and evaluate that access. Here's some that have various types of, you have the shoebox, but what you don't have is the sufficient rise above the tank surface to meet our standards. So those could be a problem. Here's one that looks pretty good. It's buried. It's locked. It's got the sufficient rise above. Anyway, this one looks pretty good. Here's some access ones that don't look so good. Again, remember what we're looking for with a sanitary survey. Kind of the first thing we're looking for is ways contamination can enter your system. If you look at these accesses, they're flush with the top of the tank, so any rainwater can wash into any of those openings and cause a problem. And then the one on the bottom there looks like it's seen better days and certainly doesn't have a gasket right now. So hopefully that got fitted with a gasket. If you have snow depths, if it's a high snow area, we're requiring you to raise up those vents higher so that you can be above the snow level, typical snow level. If that happens, we'll look for that. We're looking at an air gap, a 12-inch air gap on your drain lines, and making sure the screens for water, for the overflow, it's number 4 mesh screen. We'll make sure that those are there. And again, the vents, we'll be looking at those to make sure, again, that they're downturned so that wind-blown contamination can enter the system, that they're screened with number 14 mesh screen. And if they're big enough, 6 inches or bigger, I believe, one of our engineers can correct me, they need a support screen. But if they're smaller ones, they just need the number 14 mesh screen. And we want to, again, make sure that they're sufficient above the height of the roof of the tank so that they have free flow of air. So if you look at on the right side, the second one from the top, you can see that one is not downturned. That one would be given a deficiency because wind-blown contamination can enter that particular vent. So we would require that one to be modified. So again, then just looking at the structural integrity of the tank itself, where the concrete's corroded there. There's some seepage of water. One of the most recent waterborne disease outbreaks we've had in the recent years is just in our neighboring state of Colorado. We had one individual die, and that was from a situation like this where the tank had corroded, where the roof, the seams in the tank from concrete corroded away, and they left an opening for rodents to enter, and that was a salmonella outbreak, I believe. It was the bug that they had. Anyway, so the structural integrity of the tank is a big issue with us, and again, we'll look at that from minor to severe damage and assign the appropriate points and significance to that. So kind of last element here is your distribution system. Harder to look at, obviously, because it's, in most cases, it's buried, although not all. We're looking at the system pressures, we're looking at piping materials. Again, both hard to look at. We'll look at the air vac valves that you have, make sure they're downturned and screened. And then we'll look at, again, those air vac valves, whether they're flooded or submerged. And then ask some other questions regarding the distribution system. So again, design, pressure and flow, air vac release valves, cross connections, disinfection. Again, I had a picture, so I put it in there. But here's a air vac valve that probably would get some deficiencies. One, it's not vented above ground, above grade. I can't really see in there, but if it looked like it had been flooded recently, that would be more significant. If it was actually full of water, it would be even more. We give it even more points. So again, we'll look at the severity, and what we're looking for is that vent line comes above grade so that contamination can't get sucked back down it. And that's probably one of the biggest things that we can actually see as far as design goes. This is where our rules have changed over the years. So some of these are time related. If you now have fire hydrants on your system in any new construction, you have to have 8-inch mains providing water to that. We've modified our pressure requirements. It used to be 20 psi at all times, and now it's tiered based on the flow that you have at any given time, from fire flow to peak daily flows to just normal operating pressures. Most of the pressure issues really come into us more as customer complaint that we would follow up with you rather than question answer during a survey. But that's where we're at with kind of the distribution system issues there. And then the last one we'll look at, and it's really interspersed with all of the facilities, and that's water system security, especially since 9/11. This has really kind of jumped to an important issue, and we think it's important, and we'll make sure that your facilities have some security on them. They're locked, they're fenced, as whatever is appropriate, and then give you points if your facilities are vulnerable. So kind of in summary, if we go out and look at your water system, I could probably look in my crystal ball, being here long enough, actually having access to data and looking at it, and what are we likely to find? Now, I'm going to show you some statistics. They were used for a project about 10 years ago, but I would be willing to bet they hold true today. And that is, what are the top 25 deficiencies in order of most frequent? And what I can tell you is we have lots and lots of violation or deficiencies for cross-connection control programs. All 5 elements are represented in the top 25. But if we look beyond the cross-connection control program, then you'll find that, again, some things at the source as far as no flow measuring device, like on springs, that's a pretty common one. If you didn't have a sample tap on your wellhead, that's another pretty common one. And then we start to go into some tank violations. If you look through the list, the one that really kills me is the inadequate bacteriological sample site plan. That one probably we can take off the list. The original requirement dates back to 1991. You were supposed to have one, so even in 2007, it was ridiculous that this was on this list. But now, after the RTCR, if you still don't have one, shame on you. Okay, so should take that. I hope that one is no longer in the top 25. But we have a lot with tanks. In fact, tanks, EPA. This list was for an EPA project, so we provided this. If we looked at the deficiencies, then 21% of them were based on your tank facility. So if I were to, again, to look in my crystal ball and predict what we may find wrong with your system during a sanitary survey, I would say, oh, you may not have a complete cross-connection control program, and I bet there's a problem with your tank, because it's just the statistics support that. And I'm not going out on too big a limb, letting you know that yes, this is what we'll find. So with that, we have some senior operator or experienced operators on our staff, and they're gonna not be happy with me, but here's their contact information. They also do our technical assistance. A major portion of that's Pete Kears and Ryan Deering. Their contact information here at the division. If you're looking for templates and rules, you can go to our website. And again, for best practices, you can go to AWWA and Rural Water. And again, on our website there, drinkingwater.utah.gov, if you click on our contacts, it'll take you to a staff page that will give you contact information based on people's skill set here, and we welcome you to call any of those staff people. We're happy to help you out. So with that, Colt, do we have any questions?
I don't think so.
So we were clear as mud. Is that the?
That's the takeaway. If no one's asking questions, that, or we did schedule this one after lunch. So
in other words, it was clear as mud, or everyone is asleep.
Everyone is asleep.
Well, thank you, everyone. Again, give us a call if you have questions. We're happy to help you out. And if you want us to send you a copy of the questions we'll be asking during the survey, just give us a call. We can certainly email those out. Maybe we'll just get them put up on the website. But they're not there just yet.
All right. Thank you, Patty. So hopefully you all feel more prepared for your upcoming survey or whatever the next one may be. If you would like, as I'm sure you all would, CEUs for this, check the description just below if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're watching this through our website, you will have to click over to the Watch YouTube site to get the link to the CEU tab. And there's just 2 questions there that Patty answered in her presentation. Once again, next time, I put 11 a.m. on there for August, but we'll see. Hopefully August comes in a little bit. I believe we have scheduled another AWWA presenter in August, but we'll see how that plays out. Anyway, we look forward to seeing you next month. If you have questions, let us know. Other suggestions or topics you'd like to hear on, we're always open to it. Thanks again.